Hey everyone, Kyle Walker here. If you love cars, fixing things, or just want to understand your vehicle better, you're in the right place. I share hands-on tips, smart driving advice, and straight-up car talk without the fluff. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and stick around till the end. You don't want to miss what's coming up. Let's get
It is
into
hardly
it.
necessary to say much about the standing of Russian roads. If you are going to travel across the vast expanses of our country, you should prepare in advance for the fact that, leaving the urban area, you will encounter what can be called a road with a certain degree of conventionality. European or American car owner, when buying a car, does not pay attention to the distance to the lowest point of the bottom of the vehicle, is characterized by a particular vehicle. In Russia, the ground clearance of a car is one of the important parameters, which often has a direct impact on the buyer's choice. It is not uncommon when a new car, just brought from the showroom, is evaluated by its ground clearance. And the disparaging statement, low, in the address of a car with a small ground clearance often sounds like a verdict. How important is the value of this parameter for domestic car owners, and whether you can change it yourself, we will try to describe, with maximum attention to all the associated nuances. What is the clearance of a passenger car? The domestic GOSD on this subject says the following. Clearance is the distance between the road, support, surface, and the lowest point of the vehicle located in its center part. The latter term means the area of space between the planes equidistant from the inner edge of the wheels, located parallel to the longitudinal center line of the car. For the majority of ordinary motorists, such a complex definition practically does not say anything, and experts consider it not quite correct. Automakers, both foreign and domestic, also do not hurry to calculate where the notorious center part is located. In practice, the clearance is understood as the distance from the ground plane to the lowest point of the car near the bottom. The main problem is that it is not always easy to determine this point. In a modern car, the underbody is far from a completely flat surface, due to the lack of available space, as well as new systems being fitted to the vehicle. There is a clutter of different components, from suspension components to powertrain components, from the exhaust system to the spare tires. All this can be located at different distances from the road surface, but each of these components is characterized by the ability to contact with the unevenness of the road surface. So, strictly speaking, it would not be quite correct to associate the concept of clearance with a single, lowest point. Clearance in a car is usually measured in centimeters, and the height of ground clearance, indicated in the technical passport, can be measured independently using an ordinary tape measure. The problem is that car manufacturers do not specify in manuals which part of the car is located below all the others. So the technology of such measurements may differ significantly from model to model. We will talk about it a little later, but for now we will focus on the fact that the clearance of a car is as significant a characteristic as its dimensions. In any case, it has a direct impact on such indicators of the vehicle as maneuverability, passability, stability. On many cars, the lowest point is the muffler or resonator. On off-road vehicles, it is practiced to attach the spare wheel to the bottom, and in this case, it will be the starting point for measuring ground clearance. In the same capacity can act as a front bumper, separate elements of the power unit compartment. As you can see, ground clearance depends on the individual design features of a particular model. Classification of ground clearance. The value of ground clearance is the parameter that is taken into account when classifying this characteristic. Low ground clearance is characteristic of most passenger cars, and its absolute value lies within 11 to 18 centimeters. Medium ground clearance is characteristic of crossover and parquet cars, for which the ground clearance is 16 to 22 centimeters. High ground clearance, 20 to 42 centimeters, is characteristic of off-road vehicles. Many drivers believe that ground clearance is the only important parameter that determines the off-road capability of a vehicle. In reality, this view is far from the truth. If you look closely at vehicle descriptions, you will often see the term geometric rideability. It is rarely paid attention to, because they have little idea what it means. Meanwhile, this indicator is as important as ground clearance. In any case, it is not uncommon when a car with high geometric cross-country ability easily overcome those obstacles, which are beyond the reach of cars with ground clearance, belonging to the category of large. The matter is that overcoming of hills and pits depends on the shape of front overhang, and not only on how high they rise above the ground. In particular, the owners of rather long, going far forward bumper cars, even in the presence of a large ground clearance, can experience serious difficulties in passing obstacles. And such Dodgers are characterized not only by ordinary passenger cars, but sometimes by off-road vehicles as well. A classic example is the Cadillac Escalade, for which even driving to a tow truck is very difficult. Pitch angle belongs to the same category of indicators, indicating the maximum value of the angle in degrees under which it is possible to pass the car from a slope to a horizontal surface, and vice versa, without hitting the road with any part of the car. Cars with a large ground clearance and an increased base are an example of the fact that the angle of longitudinal cross-country ability is no less important than the clearance. For them, the usual exit from the road, sidewalk, curb can be a big problem. For megacities, where there is always a shortage of free space, the possibility of parking on the sidewalk is often a vital necessity. Therefore, sufficient ground clearance must be properly combined with the above-mentioned characteristics. In particular, cars with a small distance between the front and rear wheels are not afraid of low ground clearance. There is no need to go far for an example. Peugeot 107, this city shorty, with a clearance of only 15 centimeters, has a wheelbase of 230 cm, which allows it to easily overcome rather deep pits and equally high hillocks without unpleasant consequences for the bottom. VAZ 2131 can serve as an example of the opposite push. Unlike the prototype, the classic Niva, which can't cope with Russian off-road, the lengthening of the base by 50 centimeters has led to the fact that the car quite often tugs the belly of road irregularities. So it is not always the case that a tall SUV will be better than an ordinary passenger car. It all depends on the geometry of the car. The conclusion from the above is the following. Although the clearance of the car is considered a very important parameter when buying a car, you should pay attention to it, but only in conjunction with other properties that characterize the passability of the vehicle. It is also important to know in advance in what conditions the car will be operated. It should be noted that most of the domestic car fleet is by no means off-roaders, crossovers, and parkettes. And if your car has a small clearance, it does not mean that you will suffer from it. Knowing the features of the design of the car and careful driving, the key to the fact that you will not encounter problems that make you regret the lack of ground clearance. Read also what you need to know about the sign, narrowing the road, self-measurement of ground clearance. In many cases, the bumper of the car is the part that should be taken into consideration when measuring ground clearance. Measuring the ground clearance of a car in this case is not very difficult. Here are typical ground clearance measurements depending on the type of vehicle. For ordinary passenger cars, it is 14 to 20 centimeters. For crossovers and urban parkettes, 18 to 25 centimeters. For classic SUVs, 20 to 35 centimeters. It is not uncommon to see a car with a bumper, along the lower perimeter of which you can see a skirt, slightly protruding forward and downward. As a rule, it differs from the color of the main bumper and is installed as a kind of fuse, taking on all collisions with obstacles. Usually such micro-accidents are accompanied by a characteristic crack, which is not necessary to be frightened. Such a skirt will protect the paintwork of the rest of the bumper. It will not be difficult to replace it. It does not need to be painted. The cost of such a part is relatively small. Of course, the clearance in the presence of such an element is reduced by a few centimeters, but such a value can be sacrificed for the sake of preserving the integrity of the bumper itself. After all, its replacement in case of a collision or collision with an obstacle will cost you much more. The best way to avoid such troubles is to install a Parktronic, and it is desirable to install sensors as low as possible. In the absence of the above-mentioned skirt on the bumper or other Dodger, the lowest point of the car may be the power unit crankcase. Pan, or rather, an element called crankcase protection. There are probably other elements in the underhood space that protrude downward. For example, steering parts or individual suspension components. But usually their surface area is negligibly small compared to the pallet, which significantly reduces the probability of their damage. And the cost of their repair is relatively small, which is not the case with a damaged crankcase pan. Average clearance values in the area of the sump for ordinary cars, 12 to 17 centimeters. For crossovers and city parkettes, 17 to 21 centimeters. For classic SUVs, 20 centimeters and more. Some off-road enthusiasts deliberately remove the standard protection of the power unit, increasing the clearance in this place by several centimeters. But such a step is fraught with major troubles. A breakdown of the bottom of the sump when hitting a stone, or the formation of a dent when hitting an obstacle, which can clog the oil intake tube. So it is better not to refuse protection. However, the plastic structure, installed on some budget models, plays more of a decorative role than a protective one. Although, of course, it will protect from dust and dirt, but even not too hard obstacle, for example, a clod of dried soil, can damage such protection. Metal protection or a part made of carbon fiber is already able to resist most of the possible destabilizing factors. Carbon fiber protection is characterized by even greater strength, but car manufacturers rarely install it for the reason that in a head-on collision at high speed, the engine may be squeezed into the passenger compartment instead of falling down in a less durable material of the crankcase pan protection. To determine the clearance of the car in the area of the crankcase sump, it is not necessary to drive on an elevator, in most cases. Simply lying on the ground will suffice. But if the front end of the vehicle has successfully overcome an obstacle, it does not mean that the danger has passed. On the underbody of the car along its entire length are the exhaust system components, which can also be exposed to parts of the uneven road surface. After all, the fuel tank and the adsorber, which is usually located near it, can also get caught on a rock. In rear-wheel drive vehicles, the greatest risk of damage is to the drive shaft and the protruding part of the rear gearbox differential. That is why it is so important to carefully examine the underbody of your car, which will require installing it on a hoist or overpass. In this case, the clearance measurement becomes more complicated, since there will be no roadway directly under the studied element. Nevertheless, knowledge of the anatomy of your vehicle will certainly do you a good service, allowing you to guide the car when obstacles arise in such a way as to minimize the likelihood of damaging something. How to increase the clearance of the car with your own hands. And yet, for many car owners, the problem of low ground clearance does not let them sleep well, forcing them to find ways to increase ground clearance. In most cases, careful driving is enough to solve it, but there are also objective reasons forcing to increase the ground clearance. If the wheels of the car as a result of body shrinkage begin to cling to the fenders, if for the same reason mudguards start to rub on the road surface, if the ground clearance is so low that it does not allow normal driving on unpaved roads, if the operating conditions of the car imply its frequent and substantial loading. Some cars are initially equipped with air suspension, which allows you to change the ground clearance. Usually this is done in automatic mode, but on older cars it is necessary to perform this operation manually. For all others, it makes sense to consider the most common ways to independently increase ground clearance. Changing tires. This method of raising the clearance of the car cannot be called the most effective, but in terms of cost it is the most affordable. And if you do not count yourself among the advanced motorists, but want to perform this operation without outside help, this is the best option that does not require special knowledge and skills. For example, if the factory wheels have the size 205/60 or 16, it is enough to buy a set of tires with the characteristics of 215/65 or 16. The same tires can be installed instead of standard tires with dimensions 195/60 or 15. Thus, you can raise the car by a few centimeters, which, in general, is clearly not enough. In addition, far not always the installation of tires with a larger diameter will increase ground clearance. The fact is that many tires are characterized by low profile, that is, a reduced distance from the edge of the rubber to the tread. Buying such a set, you run the risk of achieving the opposite result, a decrease in ground clearance. This method has a number of disadvantages: distortion of speedometer readings, both in terms of measuring speed and distance traveled, increased gasoline consumption. If the tire parameters do not correspond to those recommended by the manufacturer, the tires will rub against the wheel arches when cornering, which will cause rapid wear. Read also, McPherson suspension design, and its advantages and disadvantages fitting larger diameter rims. This is the second easiest method of raising the clearance of the car. At least, its use does not require any modifications to the vehicle design. However, both wheel arch dimensions and hub diameter must be taken into account. Of course, the new disc must be compatible with the old one in terms of the location of the mounting holes. It may well happen that there are no suitable discs available for your car. The advantages and disadvantages are almost the same as when increasing the diameter of tires. To this, you can add the high cost of this procedure, because the purchase of discs with increased diameter makes it impossible to use old tires. Mounting spacers in terms of cost. This method will be out of competition, although there are nuances, as these elements can be made of different materials. From the point of view of the complexity of the procedure of increasing ground clearance, this method is not recommended for beginners. It should also be taken into account that the installation of spacers is considered an intervention in the design of the vehicle, in particular, in its running gear. The consequences of this step can be unpredictable, since the carefully calculated factory characteristics will be changed. How this will affect the behavior of the car and, accordingly, its safety, it is unknown. Nevertheless, this is the most popular way to increase the ground clearance. But first you need to decide on the type of spacers. They are metal, mostly aluminum, plastic, polyurethane, or carbon. Each of these options is characterized by its ratio of cost to durability. Thus, polyurethane and plastic elements are cheap, but they wear out many times faster than aluminum ones. When you go to an auto store, tell the salesperson what type of suspension is installed on your car and where you plan to mount the spacers. Some models are designed to be installed in the gap between the body cup and the shock absorber spring itself. So-called interscrew spacers are mounted, as the name suggests, between the coils of the springs. This method is less reliable, but does not require removal of the springs, which in itself is quite labor-intensive. The use of interscrew spacers allows not only to increase the ground clearance to the required value, but also to increase the stiffness of the shock absorber and thus get rid of the disadvantages typical for the classical method of installation we are talking about. Reducing the roll of the car when entering corners at high speed. Apart from the ground clearance growth itself, shock absorber spacers allow to get rid of a significant subsidence of the rear part of the car when the weight load increases. But there are disadvantages. The increase in stiffness leads to an increase in the vibration of suspension parts and the car body, which negatively affects their resource. Due to the change in the angles of suspension operation, you should not expect that the car handling will improve. In most cases, everything happens exactly the opposite. Increased shock absorber travel can also be considered as one of the disadvantages of using spacers. Spring replacement. One of the most radical methods of increasing the clearance of the car is the installation of products with an increased number of coils in relation to the nominal number of coils instead of the standard springs. Of all the previously discussed methods, it is the most expensive because, in addition to the purchase of the actual springs of large sizes, it is necessary to spend on the purchase of special long-travel shock absorbers corresponding to the length of the springs. However, the range of cost of these parts can also vary quite widely. It all depends on the quality of materials used for manufacturing springs and shock absorbers. The undoubted advantage of this method is a significantly greater resource, in principle, comparable to the life of the factory suspension elements, if you do not be stingy and buy quality products. Compared to spacers will also be able to reduce the subsidence of the rear of the car with increased load on the stern. But in this case, there are disadvantages, not counting the high cost of the set. The increase in the rigidity of the suspension will lead to an increase in vibration processes, reducing the life of the chassis of the car. Installing increased springs will change the angles of the suspension, which will again affect the car's handling. What you need to know about the pros and cons of increasing ground clearance. The advantages of independently changing the ground clearance in the direction of its increase are obvious. Increased ground clearance will avoid hitting obstacles in the form of road irregularities. Bumpers will not be afraid of their main enemy, sidewalk curbs. Traveling on rural and forest roads with their deep ruts will become safer. The risk of getting on the belly will be significantly reduced. Loading the car to the full will not turn driving into excruciatingly slow movement. Increased ground clearance is in any case cheaper than a complete replacement of suspension components. The disadvantages of increasing the clearance of a car are not so obvious, but can have serious consequences. The fact is that the design of cars takes into account all possible factors affecting the controllability and safety of the vehicle. In particular, passenger cars have a low stance because they are designed for traveling at high speeds when good stability is required, and it is achieved precisely due to the low location of the center of mass. The purpose of SUVs is different. Here, the ability to overcome road sections with natural obstacles, as well as good cross-country ability when driving on snow-covered roads are at the forefront. High speed is not required, although in most cases the speed capabilities of the powertrains are also very good. So changing the ground clearance of a passenger car always has a downside. When the ground clearance increases, the center of mass shifts upwards. Because of the increase in ground clearance, the aerodynamics of the car deteriorates. The airflow under the bottom of the car becomes more powerful, which worsens the grip of the wheels with the road surface. When making maneuvers at high speed, it threatens with large rolls and tearing off the side of the car, opposite to the direction of the turn from the ground. Deterioration of aerodynamics also affects the growth of fuel consumption, and this point should also be taken into account. In any case, an independent increase in DP more than 5 centimeters is not recommended, because in this case, the safety of travel suffers in the first place. And after all, this is not what drivers are trying to achieve. In conclusion, understanding car clearance and exploring ways to increase it can significantly enhance your vehicle's performance and safety. Whether you're considering suspension upgrades, tire choices, or weight distribution adjustments, each method offers unique benefits, tailored to your driving needs. By implementing these strategies, you can improve your vehicle's off-road capability, protect it from damage, and ensure a smoother ride. Remember, the right clearance not only enhances your driving experience, but also contributes to the longevity of your car. Thank you for watching, and drive safely.